Godzilla is a cult favorite of millions in this age. Since its creation, the Godzilla franchise has really set the scene for science fiction media. So far, everyone's favorite colossal kaiju has always been classified as protector of humankind, but this wasn't always the case, when in fact, the Showa era of Godzilla films portrayed him mainly as an unstoppable, villainous force of nature. In this marvelous video, let's talk about how he started out as the bad guy and slowly turned into a preferred anti-hero. How does the wicked king of the monsters compare to his usual heroic self? Let's find out. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Gojira, 1954. The first Godzilla movie to grace the big screens came out in 1954. This is when it all began. Directed by Ishiro Honda, Gojira is still considered to be one of the best monster movies ever made. A creature slumbering in the ocean was awoken by the reckless testing of nuclear weapons done by humans. When boats and ships began to sink and yielded nearly no survivors, it drew the government's attention to Odo Island. Professor Yamane and his daughter rushed to the island to investigate and found a colossal reptilian beast wreaking havoc on the villages of Odo Island. This beast was named Godzilla. We must remember that Godzilla, as a concept, was meant to be a metaphor for nuclear weapons. With the events of the war still frighteningly fresh on people's minds, artists coped by making tragic fictional monsters like Godzilla come to life. In the first film, this had an intense impact on audiences, for symbols like Godzilla's scales, which seemed to represent survivors of war, really drove the point home. At this point, Godzilla was still a new and foreign beast, so not only was his rampage unnerving to everyone who witnessed it, but there was also a fear of the unknown, since his abilities and the extent to which he actually was dangerous weren't fully known. For all they knew, Godzilla was an ancient god angered by the carelessness of humans. Godzilla Raids Again, 1955. This film was the second movie of the Godzilla franchise. At the end of the first movie, Dr. Serizawa sacrificed himself and used the weapon known as the Oxygen Destroyer to kill Godzilla. However, considering the success the movie received, it couldn't be left as a standalone film. This time, Godzilla Raids Again followed the story of a second Godzilla who was created by the same bomb that made the first one. The Second Street Godzilla had lurked underneath the ocean's surface for a year longer before he decided to show face. A new monster had also risen. It went by the name of Anguirus, a spotter for a shipping fleet. Koji Kobayashi crashed on a remote island. Koji's friend followed him in an attempt to rescue the spotter. To their horror, the two pilots found two monsters who were rapidly making their way towards Osaka. The rest of the film closely documented the struggles of the Japanese self-defense and air forces as they attempted everything in their feeble power to stop the reinvented king of the monsters. Anguirus and Godzilla's battle left the city as a pile of rubble, and Godzilla was seemingly killed again by an avalanche triggered by the Japanese air forces. Many fans believe that this film's plot felt rushed, and it didn't do anything to perpetuate the story for future sequels. King Kong vs. Godzilla, 1962. King Kong has always been shown in a benevolent light in all the films that he's featured in so far. So was the case in the 1962 version of King Kong vs. Godzilla. In the original Japanese version, a man named Takao was the director of Pacific Pharmaceuticals. He was unhappy with the low engagement of his documentary series, which he also sponsored. Trying a new approach, the director sent a team to Faro Island to track down King Kong. This was for the sole purpose of exploiting Kong for increased viewership of the company's documentary. Tako's plan of sensationalizing his mediocre show went belly up when Godzilla broke out of his iceberg. An American nuclear submarine crashed into an iceberg, which in turn freed the Big G. The king of the monsters had set his sights on Japan and made his way there. Meanwhile, Tako's plan of transporting Kong back to Japan had gone smoothly. The director realized how much money his company would make if he showed off a battle between the two mammoth kaiju. Kong and Godzilla wrestled until the Japanese self-defense forces intervened and deployed the two monsters to Mount Fuji. Godzilla is shown to be a destructive and offensive force of nature, which wouldn't stop at anything to take down his enemy ape. In the film, Kong is shown to be a peaceful character, while Godzilla is stuck out as the villain. Mothra vs. Godzilla, 1964. As the franchise moved forward, Toho took leaps of creative liberties to pit Godzilla against various monsters. The film, Mothra vs. Godzilla, was released in 1964 and proved to be a direct sequel to the 1961 film, Mothra, which was also directed by Ishiro Honda. When a brutal typhoon hit a district in Japan, the story was covered by reporters Ichiro and Junko. As they reached the site, they also stumbled upon a giant egg that had been found by the villagers. Teamed up with Professor Mura, the journalists realized that the egg had been stolen by an ill-intentioned businessman who planned to exploit it for commercial purposes. Mothra's priestesses from Infant Island showed up to retrieve the egg, but were denied. They even tried to warn the businessmen about the terrible consequences of when the egg hatches. Disturbances in nature's flow always seem to awaken Godzilla. As the Big G emerged from the wisps of the typhoon, the people of Japan began to feel helpless. The journalists, along with the professor, begged the people of Infant Island and Mothra for their help. Mothra herself made the decision to help the people of Japan from Godzilla's senseless destruction of their home. As the two monsters fought, Mothra was injured, and she rushed to her egg in a last attempt to hatch it. The larvae that emerged used their cunning to trap Godzilla in woven silk. The Return of Godzilla, 1984. The Return of Godzilla in the 80s is said to be a Cold War analogy of that time. It was also the first installment of the Heisei era of Toho Godzilla movies. The decade also saw a revolution in science fiction media. Thus, this time, Godzilla returned with much darker roots. A Japanese fishing boat is overwhelmed by a ferocious storm when the people on board also spot an ungodly beast. The wreckage of the fishing vessel was found by a reporter, Goro Maki. The only survivor claimed that he saw a resurrected Godzilla. Surprisingly, this news was hushed by the Japanese government to prevent sparking mass panic amongst the public. Even Goro Maki was forbidden to publish his story on the lone survivor and his account of Godzilla. When the king of the monster attacked a Soviet ship close to Japan's waters, the Soviets assumed the worst. They believed that the Americans had planned the attack, and the conflict nearly escalated into nuclear war. A meeting of the ambassadors from all three countries concluded that nuclear weaponry wouldn't be used against Godzilla, even if he attacked the cities of Japan. After being taken down by the Japanese self-defense forces, Godzilla is revived by an induced electrical radioactive storm, only to be then toppled into the center of a volcano crater. In this movie, we see the human-made concepts of war that drive the plot. Godzilla never differentiated between borders. Godzilla vs. Bolante, 1989. The conceptualization of this film was considered fairly unconventional. One of the franchise's producers arranged a public writing contest, so fans were free to pitch their most creative plots for a potential movie. Dentist Shinichiro Kobayashi's story came to life in the form of Godzilla vs. Bolante. The story was about the aftermath of the destruction caused by Godzilla during the Cold War. Renowned geneticist Genichiro Shiragami is tasked to study the collected cells of Godzilla known as G cells. Godzilla's cells were considered a precious resource, which prompted several groups to get their hands dirty in order to attain the samples. In doing so, Dr. Genichiro's daughter was killed in a freak accident. In his maddened state of grief, he created an abomination of nature named Bolante, which also posed as a government-sanctioned project against Godzilla. Bolante was made from a fearsome formulation of Genichiro's daughter's roses and Godzilla's cells, which gave the monster regenerative properties. The volcano in which Godzilla was previously buried erupted. Shortly after, Godzilla appeared on the scene, and the two monsters engaged in a violent tussle. The confrontation ended with Bolante's spores evaporating into space, while Godzilla was thrown into the ocean. This film is said to be a deep dive into a father's grief over the tragic demise of his daughter. Godzilla was still shown to be the major antagonistic force. Godzilla vs. King Gadora, 1991. King Gadora had previously been featured in Honda's 1964 film, Gadora, the three-headed monster. His 1991 iteration cannot be considered as the primary villain. Before it all began, Godzilla was still weak from his battle with Bolante. He remained asleep in the sea for 2 years, from 1989 to 1991. A group of time travelers from the 23rd century rushed to the present day to warn Japan about the future of their nation. The time travelers informed the state that if Godzilla is left unchecked, his subsequent return will completely annihilate Japan and its people. A mission was undertaken to stop the creation of Godzilla by going back in time. The team returned to Lagos Island, where the dinosaur, which would be Godzilla, was first exposed to the Castle Bravo H-bomb test. However, the men from the future held ulterior motives, as they released tiny tiny creatures known as Dorats near the testing site. These creatures mutated into the three-headed monstrosity, which came to be known as King Gadora. The kaiju began to terrorize Japan, but the Japanese government discovered that Godzilla had escaped their plan of wiping out his existence. Godzilla destroyed a nuclear submarine and absorbed its radiation. A charged-up king of the monsters then confronted Gadora, and the two beasts laid waste throughout the entire land. King Gadora was used as a pawn in the game of the Futurians, and their plan to unleash him on Japan. Godzilla vs. Mothra, 1992. The success that Godzilla vs. King Gadora saw inspired Toho to bring back various kaiju from the Showa era of films. The 1992 counterpart of Godzilla vs. Mothra was quite similar to the 1962 one, but it put more emphasis on varying themes. The groundbreaking impact of a meteorite that hit Earth was strong enough to shake Godzilla out of his slumber. Unbeknownst to anyone, another monster was awakened. This was the dark divine Batra, who was considered to be the evil counterpart of the benevolent goddess Mothra. Mothra's priestesses appeared yet again to warn Japan about the threat that Batra posed. The priestesses allowed the government to carefully transport their deity, Mothra's egg, to Japan. During this, Godzilla ambushed the egg, and Mothra was forced to hatch prematurely. The final battle ensued in Yokohama, where the three monsters faced each other. Batra and Mothra nearly destroyed each other, but realized that they must team up to defeat Godzilla. In this movie, Godzilla is shown to be the enemy of all, to such an extent that two ancient foes put their differences aside and began to work together. We see a villain to the hero story arc for Batra. Audiences were blessed with beautiful scenes such as Batra and Mothra flying a troublesome Godzilla over the ocean. Their combined abilities were sufficient to weaken him as well. Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, 1993. Mechagodzilla is a recurring character in all eras of Godzilla films. Directed by Takao Okawara, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2 brought back the last members of Toho's Big Five kaiju group. The Big Five consisted of Godzilla, Mothra, and King Gadora, and with this film came Mechagodzilla and Rodan. Godzilla was already a classified threat to humanity. A whole branch of the UN was founded as a countermeasure to the destruction he caused. The United Nations Godzilla Countermeasure Center had just finished the construction of Mechagodzilla. Mechagodzilla was built as the protector of Japan against Godzilla's wrath. Meanwhile, on Adonia Island, a group of scientists found a pteranodon nest with an unhatched egg and Rodan. Godzilla's arrival on the scene allowed the scientists to steal away the egg that had hatched into a baby Godzillasaurus. The G-Force, which is a special military force to fight Godzilla, planned to use the baby Godzillasaurus to summon Godzilla to the spot where Mechagodzilla could quickly kill him. Rodan disrupted this plan, and the final face-off between him. Sadly, this movie was the only time we got to see Fire Rodan. Godzilla, 1998. This film was the first American reboot of the giant atomic beast, and not just a dubbed-over version of the Toho films. So consider it Godzilla's debut in Hollywood. An unknown beast was jarred out of a sleep by the French government's nuclear testing in French Polynesia. The monster somehow managed to make his way towards New York City, and immediately started wrecking it. The main protagonist of the film, Dr. Nick Tatopoulos, conspired that the monster was capable of asexual reproduction. The beast that was knighted as Godzilla and his spawn would take over New York City. Dr. Nick teamed up with the French Secret Service to hunt down Godzilla's nest. When Godzilla discovered all his offspring were dead, he chased down the ones responsible through Manhattan. He unsuccessfully tried to fit through the Brooklyn Bridge, but got trapped in the suspension cables. Bombarded with missiles by American fighter jets, the Big G finally succumbed to pain and fell dead. Godzilla 1998 wasn't meant to be a prequel or sequel to any existing movies. In the American version as well, Godzilla was a destructive force, now fueled by the rage over the death of his babies. Now, this movie faced mixed reactions from audiences, but this was when the sympathy for the monster was kindled. It evoked the same feeling as watching Kong being shot down while he clung to the top of the Empire State Building. Godzilla, Mothra, and King Gadora. Giant Monsters All-Out Attack, 2001. Three of the Big Five made a return in this movie of the Heisei era. In Godzilla, Mothra, and King Gadora, the Big G sought revenge for those who died in the Pacific War. To protect Japan from Godzilla, Professor Idayama summoned Mothra, Gadora, and a kaiju named Baragon to stop him. These three beasts were termed the Guardian Monsters, as they arose to protect the country as a collective mighty force. Amidst a chaotic battle of poisonous stingers, energy blasts, atomic breaths, and fighter jets of the Japanese self-defense forces, the three monsters managed to render render Godzilla unconscious. He sank to the bottom of the ocean, but wouldn't have remained there for long. This film is viewed as slightly strange, in fans' opinion, since it only brought back underwhelming characters, and the story felt somewhat repetitive. The only key difference was that Godzilla exacted his revenge for those who perished during the war. He's always posed as punishment for the folly of humans and unprecedented killing or nuclear testing. Many even say that King Ghidorah's 3 necks in the movie look abnormally short, but at least we got to see Baragon. Godzilla against Mechagodzilla, 2002. This movie of the Millennium series gave us the 4th incarnation of Godzilla, still as villainous. He threatened to attack Japan in 1999. The government dug up the skeletal remains of the first Godzilla and engineered them into a Mechagodzilla, which was codenamed Kiryu. The construction of Kiryu ended in 2003, just as Godzilla returned to terrorize Yokohama. In a bizarre turn of events, Godzilla's roar triggered the essence of the original Godzilla inside of Kiryu. This made Mechagodzilla lose all sense and began attacking the Japanese forces. The lead scientist who worked on Kiryu rushed to the scene to gain control of his mechanical kaiju. Godzilla fled back to Tokyo Bay shortly before making landfall again. Kiryu and Godzilla battled till the kaiju, made of flesh and bones, began to tire out. Mechagodzilla dragged him over Tokyo Bay once again until the absolute zero cannon was denoted, and Godzilla was left with a gaping wound in his chest. Kiryu emerged victorious in this fight. In this movie, the people of Japan took a step to put an end to a long-standing threat that they faced in the form of Godzilla. He was viewed as a living obstacle to their precious peace. He was born through the meddling of humans. In a lot of ways, Godzilla represents the unwanted consequences of our reckless action. Godzilla Tokyo SOS, 2003. During the Millennium era, Godzilla's role in films was always ambiguous rather than downright heroic or villainous. Godzilla Tokyo SOS is a sequel to Godzilla against Mechagodzilla. A year after the Kiryu and Godzilla battle, Mothra's priestesses appeared again. They made a plea to the Japanese government to restore the old bones of the first Godzilla, as turning him into a mechanical weapon of war is a direct defiance of nature's order. The government naturally hesitated to get rid of Kiryu, which undoubtedly cost millions of yen. It wouldn't be a Godzilla film without the king of the monsters making his way towards the nearest civilization with the intent of destroying it. Mothra was summoned, and the beast held her own against Godzilla, but eventually he overpowered her. The signal is set for Kiryu to be deployed in battle yet again. Mechagodzilla and Godzilla fought just as 2 of Mothra's larvae from Hamago Island also showed up in battle. Mothra jumped in to shield her offspring from Godzilla's atomic breath, thus sacrificing herself. Mothra's spawn continued to fight relentlessly along with Kiryu. The robotic kaiju used his drill hand to reopen the wound Godzilla had sustained the previous year, while the 2 larvae encased him in webbing. In the end, we see Godzilla and Kiryu locked in a fierce battle as they fly over the sea, shortly after which they fall in, not to be seen again. Godzilla Final Wars, 2004. On Godzilla's 50th anniversary, Toho decided to go big or go home. Also, the Millennium era of Godzilla films could have done much better in comparison to their Heisei counterparts. Toho originally conceptualized the plot of bringing back Godzilla Jr. from the golden era of the Godzilla franchise. So far, fans have seen Godzilla Jr. in the 1995 movie Godzilla vs. Destoroyah, in which he was brutally killed by Destoroyah. This potential plot would have been perfect to explore Godzilla's adopted son's background in detail. It would have added several emotional, familial elements that would turn the tide of sentiments towards Godzilla. Instead, the producers came up with an entirely different concept. In celebration of Big G's birthday, they decided to make a movie with all the kaiju that existed in the franchise so far. In this movie, a mysterious race of aliens known as the Exilians make an appearance under the pretense of saving humankind from these monsters. However, their real intentions are revealed by the Earth Defense Force. With their plan exposed, the Exilians wasted no time and unleashed all the deadly kaiju on humankind. The EDF rushed to free Godzilla, who was the only one capable of fighting off all of the beasts. We can see that when humanity is faced with other unfamiliar threats, their response is to enlist Godzilla's prowess. The film does a good job of displaying the unflinching strength that Godzilla possesses, and how this will come in handy in the future. This movie also blessed us with scenes like King Caesar kicking Anguirus like a soccer ball towards Godzilla. Shin Godzilla, 2016. Shin Godzilla is the first Toho film after a 12-year break in the franchise. It is considered a new beginning, where the story visits Godzilla's tragic origin. Godzilla wholly represents transformation. In this movie, the creature that would soon evolve into Godzilla resided in the sea as a prehistoric animal that forcefully mutated because of all the nuclear waste being dumped into the ocean. Shin Godzilla's second nightmarish form made landfall. While extremely grotesque to look at, it's a pitiful sight to behold. Stood on all fours, it struggled to breathe out outside water as indicated by his bulbous bleeding gills. The final form of Shin Godzilla is shown near the end of the movie. Shin Godzilla stood amidst buildings and townhouses. There is something inherently unnerving about his appearance, as though this abomination was never supposed to be created, even accidentally. One could sense the shift in perspective regarding Godzilla during this film. While some may consider him an unforgivable brute, others began to pity him. Shin Godzilla did an excellent job at portraying the sheer agony Godzilla is in all the time. Godzilla is a monster who was created against his own will. The music that played during Shin Godzilla's final rampage through Tokyo can be considered as a lament. Essentially, from Shin Godzilla's perspective, he is truly and utterly alone in his agony. The film is also a commentary on the inner workings of the bureaucracy of Japan. It places responsibility on human functioning. Godzilla, Planet of the Monsters, 2017. The next installment of Godzilla movies was 3 anime movies that posed as a trilogy. The story follows the scenario of a post-apocalyptic Earth after it was taken over by kaiju. The king of them all was none other than Godzilla. In previous Toho films, Godzilla could be passed off as an anti-hero. However, in Planet of the Monsters, Godzilla was the assigned bad guy. He is shown to be as brutal and unforgiving as he ever has been. With Godzilla as the king of them all, he wiped out the remaining populations and mercilessly killed any monster that opposed his rule. In Planet of the Monsters, a power-hungry Godzilla is an embodiment of greed, rage, and cunning. This is the movie where he truly feels like an ominous villain. He's mean and incapacitated for any compassion or even a smidge of kindness. Godzilla is shown to be the predator of the planet rather than a protector. We must also remember that humans were responsible for turning Earth into a kaiju playground. They steadily destroyed the planet through nuclear testing. Godzilla, City on the Edge of Battle, 2018. The second film of the anime Godzilla trilogy also introduced a supersized Mechagodzilla. The movie followed the story of the remaining survivors of Godzilla's onslaught and how they were captured by a tribe called the Hautua people. The Hautua are non-violent people and even advised the survivors not to keep fighting Earth Godzilla since he cannot be defeated. After all, he is classified as the most powerful kaiju. It is revealed that the Hautua people craft their weapons using nanometal, which is the same material used to build Mechagodzilla. The facility that was used to store the original Mechagodzilla was now dubbed as Mechagodzilla City, and the robotic kaiju had turned into a city. This was possible because Mechagodzilla's nanotechnology slowly spread, forming a whole metropolis. The team of survivors managed to trap Godzilla in Mechagodzilla City, and it began to work its nanotechnology magic. But the king of the kaijus broke free. The tyrannical Godzilla then killed one of his oldest foes for good. This was the permanent end of Mechagodzilla. Marvelous Verdict. Godzilla has had quite the journey, first as a justifying force of nature, then as an anti-hero who eventually becomes the savior of humankind. Godzilla never had outwardly malicious intent, except in the movies where his sole mission was to eradicate humanity. Godzilla can be described as a misunderstood creature. The lament in Shin Godzilla questions, if Godzilla dies in this world, who will know something of him? A downward slope is all he sees. Even the director of most of the Godzilla movies, Ishiro Honda, stated, "Monsters are tragic beings. They are born too tall, too strong, too heavy. They are not evil by choice. That is their tragedy." And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe.